in BookTube. It's Mike from Riff Raff's Reading Renaissance, and today's video is all about Shaketember, the month-long celebration of all things Shakespeare. Our hosts are Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading, Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Nicole at A Day of Small Things. The mandate is fairly broad. You can read a play, you can read sonnets, you can read a retelling of Shakespeare, non-fiction, or a film adaptation, or a documentary, or any of the above. It's just about engaging with Shakespeare. When I was working out how to tackle the subject of Shaketember, I was accosted, as always, from my library with a vast array of books about Shakespeare, and I thought, how do I break this down and tackle it in some sort of sensible way? So I've decided to look at it in two parts. On first, books that help you with accessibility to Shakespeare, and secondly, books that deal with deconstruction of Shakespeare. Obviously, there's the plays themselves, and in terms of the accessibility, if one starts with the sort of almost obligatory complete works, almost everybody I suspect in BookTube has on their shelves the complete works of Shakespeare, and I'm no exception. So they're all here, so whichever one I need to access, I can access. I also have a similar copy of what's called the Illustrated Stratford Shakespeare. It's all the plays, all 37 and 160 sonnets and poems, with over 450 illustrations on 1,024 pages. And I only know that because it's all cited here proudly on the front cover. The illustrations, if I open it to this is the three witches engaging with Macbeth. So you get an idea of the style of the illustrations as we go through. So that's just direct accessibility to the plays. I do have some copies of the individual plays. I'm not going to bother to show them all individually because I'm sure everybody's familiar with them. The next level, I suppose, of accessibility to Shakespeare is the question of biographies, trying to get to know the man. And there are three here that interest me. The first one is Peter Ackroyd's Shakespeare, which I have not read. I intend to read this, probably not this month because of pressures from elsewhere, Shorty September, etc. But this, I'm told, is a very good biography of Shakespeare. So that's on the list of things I need to do to get to know Shakespeare better. The second one is this book called In Search of Shakespeare by Michael Wood. And this is a companion piece to a BBC series. If I read you from the back of the book, it says, in this enthralling book, Michael Wood evokes the physical and intellectual environment in which Shakespeare lived and worked with vivid and original immediacy. So that's another book to help you understand the context and world of Shakespeare. It looks absolutely fascinating. But perhaps a bit more my speed in Shorty September is Bill Bryson's Shakespeare, because that's all of 200 and no, not even 200. It is exactly 200. I lie not. It's exactly 200 pages. So this qualifies both for Shorty September and for Shaketember. So I am going to give a serious attempt to get through reading this biography of Shakespeare, which has been very highly spoken of as well. A work worthy of one of the greatest writers in the English language, says the Daily Express. Best-selling writer Bryson's brilliantly readable biography of our greatest dramatist and poet is updated to mark the 400th anniversary of his death. So that's on the TBR for the month of September. So you've got those three as sort of biography type books to guide you. And then you have more specific guides. And there's an absolute plethora of them, many of which I have in my shelves. Perhaps the godfather of them all is the rather intimidating Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, by the one and only Harold Bloom. It's a vast book. I've delved into it, but I won't claim to have read it from end to end. What is quite nice is it's structured by play, so you can sort of dip into it. Harold Bloom is very erudite, but his reading is not something you can toss off in an afternoon. You do have to be in the mood to take him seriously and absorb the messages that he's giving you about Shakespeare. but there's no doubting his lifelong passion. In fact, many people said of all the many books he wrote, this one was the one he had been waiting to write all his life. So definitely worth further investigation. If one moves to something slightly less intimidating, there is this book, The Nation, which I presume is the UK, The Nation's Favourite Comic Poems. And this poem includes, of course, Shakespeare. There's a poem in here called My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head, etc., etc. Okay, not side-splitting, I have to say, but comic poem nonetheless. The reason I chose that particular poem, which is called My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, is the phrase nothing like the sun will pop up later in this video for another reason, as another Shakespeare book. Okay, that's down the road. The next guide I have is the Cambridge Shakespeare Guide, which is pretty much just a straightforward guide to all the plays, characters, and interpretations. There are many in this sort of thing. You get another book called the Penguin Shakespeare Dictionary, which is literally, you look up a character, you look up a name, Falstaff Sir John, and it tells you the play and the context in which that character appeared. So useful, if a bit derivative. Then it gets a little bit more interesting, because then you have Leon Garfield's Shakespeare Stories. This is retellings of Shakespeare in terms of making the stories more accessible to those who are intimidated by the actual play and the language. The Guardian says a magnificent book, stirring in its own right, as well as an enticing gateway into the original plays. So there's that. I'm spoilt for choice, I have to tell you. And in the same theme, of course, and perhaps better known, is the Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. Charles and Mary Lamb. Again, the Tales of Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb were written as an introduction to the study of Shakespeare, but are much more entertaining than that. All of the best-loved plays are retold in a clear and robust style that has made them popular and sought after ever since their first publication in 1807. Okay, but I suppose if you're talking Shakespeare, 1807 is relatively modern. So there's that. So we have a large choice of ways of accessing Shakespeare. But the last one I want to talk about in terms of accessibility is another book that tackles it from the same perspective. This one's called Stories from Shakespeare, the complete plays of William Shakespeare, retold by Marshett Chute, if I'm saying that name correctly. And what appealed to me about this book is the style with which she starts describing the stories. I was really quite taken by, she's writing on the assumption that you're not familiar with the stories, which is probably a very good assumption to make with a book like this. But if I just read you a few, and I'll limit it to her literally the first sentence she writes for each of a couple of Shakespeare's well-known plays. So let's just open up to Romeo and Juliet. And her first sentence on Romeo and Juliet says, Romeo and Juliet is the first of Shakespeare's great tragedies and the loveliest. Okay, I'm tempted to read more, but I'll be disciplined and I'll go to Othello, the first sentence. Othello is a melodrama that is exalted into tragedy through the brilliance of its characterization and the magnificence of its poetry. I must admit, I'm taken with the way she writes. Macbeth reads as follows. Macbeth is one of the greatest of the tragedies, swift as night and dark as spilt blood, with death and battle and witchcraft bound together in wonderful poetry to tell the story of a man and woman who destroyed themselves. Boy, if that doesn't make you want to read the play, nothing will. King Lear, with a nod to Kelly. King Lear is the most titanic of the tragedies, a huge, shattering, almost superhuman play whose very shapelessness is part of its strength. And finally, Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra tells the story of rulers so mighty that they divided the world among them, and of a love so gigantic and so tempestuous that it dragged armies and navies after it like toys. Boy, I like this one. This of the three recent options I showed you about how to read the stories without actually reading the stories, this is the one I like best of those three. Okay, and then as we come to the end of the accessibility section and we start to segue towards the Deconstructing Shakespeare section, there's a book that sort of bridges the gap and provides a segue. This is a brilliantly titled book. It's called Exit Pursued by a Bear, which of course is a line from one of Shakespeare's plays. And the book itself is a rather uninspiring A to Z guide to Shakespeare's plays, poems, and stagecraft by Louise McConnell, which is written by Michael Boyd, the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Starts with a quote from Ben Jonson and ends with one of his own opinions. And those two statements, I think, will set us up perfectly for the discussion I want to have about deconstructing Shakespeare. He starts by saying Ben Jonson's famous 1623 quotation that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time, is as true today as it was then. And then he finishes his foreword by saying, there's a special joy in discovering that this exotic world being translated is actually your world, seen through an earlier lens. And that opens the way for a discussion about deconstructing Shakespeare for both the fact that we live in a different time, and in my particular case, I live on a different continent from where Shakespeare and his plays were written, and the concepts of the societies in which we live have changed dramatically. Now, no one's a bigger fan than I am of Shakespeare in its original form. I was raised as a complete lover of everything to do with English literature, and I bow to his fantastic skills. But I do see a challenge in terms of making sure that modern readers who come from many different lived experiences may not have the same compulsion to approach Shakespeare, or even have the opportunity to be exposed to or schooled in Shakespeare that some of us have been fortunate enough to have. So it becomes a question of what does one do about that to try and make sure that the benefits of Shakespeare are made accessible to all possible readers. And here I have a couple of books I want to discuss because I think maybe some of these books, particularly this one, I think might be a little bit less known to the BookTube community, or certainly the Shakespeare lovers within them. If I'm wrong, I'm delighted. Please tell me in the comments. But I want to start with a book by Martin Orkin called Shakespeare Against Apartheid, which I must admit I was not expecting to find a book with both the words Shakespeare and apartheid in them. But here it is. And in fact, it is a pioneering work written by Martin Orkin in 1987. Now, just for context, the first democratic free elections were held in 1994. Mandela was released in the early 90s, so this is before that. 1987 was the heart of troubled times in South Africa, as the country was in the throes of reinventing itself with a lot of violence and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of upheaval. So the context of this is quite interesting. It's a work that challenges us to reframe Shakespeare in a South African political context. And of course, one remembers that the Shakespearean plays were written in the 1600s, which was, of course, only 50 years or so before Jan van Riebeeck set foot on the shores of Cape Town to establish a vegetable garden for the Dutch East India Company, the beginnings of the colonial presence in South Africa. But the book challenges the concepts that are often associated with Shakespeare, that of universal truths, timelessness, depoliticized and neutral interpretations. And it actually says that regimes such as the apartheid regime actually liked Shakespeare because of this depoliticization, and trying to suggest that the messages of Shakespeare were above and beyond and timeless, and not open to local interpretation. And it makes the argument that issues of education and culture exist in a society, and if that society is unjust, then those education and cultural issues become arenas of struggle. This is not to negate the Western traditions of Shakespeare, but to recognize that they need to be understood in the terms of a material struggle, especially in terms of the local realities of society in which the readers or students of Shakespeare actually live. And it takes an argument that says that a story like King Lear, for example, when you understand that it is about the acquisition and dispossession of wealth and land, that for a South African reader of the time resonates very strongly with the racial laws, the 1913 Native Land Act laws, which literally forbade certain people from owning certain land. And therefore, the story of wealth and power of King Lear needs to be seen in that context, because that is a context that becomes real to the reader. Similarly, Hamlet contains, the famous lines of "something is rotten in the state of Denmark," but the suggestion again was we had our own version of an authoritarian state that dominated, had illegitimacy, and was oppressive of the people who'd lived in the apartheid state. And that linkage makes it a lot more realistic as a lived experience for the Shakespearean scholar. Othello, again, is not merely about marital jealousy, but it's also about the racial prejudice that comes from othering and the prevalent colonial perspectives of the time. Equally, Macbeth, with its Scottish king, it was written at a time when England had King James on the throne, who was indeed a Scottish king, and a little bit of argy-bargy going on there between the legitimacy of the English king and the Scottish claims. And again, it underlines the equivocacy of power, the changeability of power, the violence that can go with it, and the possibility of change, which of course was massively relevant to the South African context in the late 1980s. So, an interesting book. Depends, probably not to everyone's cup of tea, but I have to say, in a local context here, I thought it was a very interesting and bold attempt to make sure that Shakespeare reached the fullest audience possible in a manner that was most accessible. Along a similar theme, the next book I want to raise, which again may not have had a lot of international awareness, is called African Tales from Shakespeare. And this is written by a guy called Geoffrey Hairsnape, who is the Emeritus Professor of English at Cape Town University, written in 1999. So this is now after the big political change in South Africa. But he has in the book 10 short narratives. The whole book is 105 pages long. So each of the 10 narratives is very short, which again is similar to the local traditions of African storytelling. It's inspired. The stories are each inspired by Shakespeare. If I look at the contents page, if you can see that, you will see names of stories on the left, but I've written crib notes next to them because each of them is very clearly a derivative from one of Shakespeare's plays. So for example, The Merchant of Venice has been translated here into Portia's Portia, the first name being Portia and the second word being the car. She's obviously a successful lawyer if she's driving Portia's Porsche. And equally, King Lear has been morphed into the tradition. We have a famous Afrikaans writer called Herman Charles Bosman, who wrote many, many stories about South African life on the veldt. And in this case, King Lear has been translated into Koning Leeu, which would mean King Lion, technically from the Afrikaans. So there is this attempt here to tell parallel stories. This is one step more derivative than those earlier retellings of Shakespeare. This is telling equivalent stories, but containing the same themes, taking the Shakespearean themes and applying them into an African context with the African oral and literary traditions, reshaping perhaps the Western Shakespearean canon and filtering it through an African lens. A very interesting attempt. Not in any way to replace the originals. I mean, they are in fact part of the canon for a reason, but I think I applaud the efforts of attempts by local authors here to simply make things accessible to people who might not otherwise ever cross over into Shakespearean territory. And now we have a slight shift. We're still under the deconstruction side of the discussion, but now the discussion takes a bit of a feminist twist, because there's 3 books I've encountered which tackle Shakespeare from a sort of feminist perspective. The first of these is Shakespeare's Division of Experience, by Marilyn French. It says here, the author of The Woman's Room, and I'm sure people know that. It was a very successful novel in its time. The idea here is that Marilyn French analyzes Shakespeare's work and argues that he divides the human experience between the sexes, that the male experience is about order, hierarchy, authority, control, domination, etc., while the female experience is about connection, nurturing, community, and acceptance, mirroring, in fact, the patriarchal culture of both the time and, one could even argue, now. She analyzes further that Shakespeare's comedies all resolve, the story always resolves to a successful outcome being a marriage. The tragedies and histories always resolve to an outcome of power struggles, violence, and death. And she argues that the one is reflecting the female and the other is reflecting the male. Inevitably, in these stories, particularly the tragedies, the female principles end up marginalized or destroyed. Think of Lady Macbeth, think of Desdemona, think of Cordelia. What she argues, though, it's not an attack on Shakespeare. She's saying that Shakespeare is actually very aware of these 2 sides and the cost of dividing the genders and effectively having competing ways of being human. And that he recognizes the need for human beings to balance the male order and the female balance in order to avoid the chaos that would otherwise ensue. So another very interesting analysis, perhaps not quite what you'd expect when you start thinking, okay, Shakespeare, there's a lot more to it. Then the next book under the same feminist theme that I wanted to follow is a book rather brilliantly called Women of Will, which obviously has double meaning. It says on the cover here, The Remarkable Evolution of Shakespeare's Female Characters. The book is by Tina Packer, and it divides Shakespeare female characters into 5 stages and argues that there is an evolution of these characters as he matured artistically as a dramatist and even spiritually. The 5 categories she uses are: 1, warrior woman; 2, where sexual merges with the spiritual with new knowledge, and she cites people like Juliet, Cressida, Cleopatra, and Beatrice as examples of that. Stage 3, she calls it the living underground, or dying to tell the truth, which involves switching genders, cross-dressing, etc. And she references Ophelia, Desdemona, and Cordelia. And her 4th stage is about chaos. She talks about the lion eats the wolf, Hamlet to Macbeth, Goneril and Regan, Timon of Athens. And finally, stage 5, she calls the maiden phoenix, where the daughter redeems the father. And she cites Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, and Henry VIII. It's an interesting premise. I need to give it a little bit more thought as to whether I fully understand and accept the stages of development she's talking about. But it's certainly a fascinating and slightly different take again on the wonderful world of the characters of William Shakespeare. And coming up next is a book again on the question on Shakespeare from a feminist perspective. This one is called Shakespeare's Wife, and it's by the well-known Germaine Greer. If I read from the back, it says, excellent, a marvelous imagining of the life of Shakespeare's wife, and a devastating exposure of the misogyny of the male biographers who has disparaged her. This I have not yet read, but I understand that it seeks to rehabilitate Mrs. Shakespeare, otherwise known as Anne Hathaway, and it argues that she's been unfairly treated in many biographies over the years due to misogynistic assumptions. And apparently she tackles the issues of the time and argues that a lot of the arguments that made against Shakespeare's wife are not understanding the context in which they lived. Issues like the age gap, where Shakespeare was 18 and Anne Hathaway was 26. This issue of Shakespeare's will, where he left Anne Hathaway his second best bed, which a lot of people have seen as an insult. Or as the kids would say today, as a diss, but she argues that's not necessarily so if seen in the context of the times. And she argues that Anne has a strong resilience, both the fact that Shakespeare lived away from home for a lot of his life, which was because, of course, Stratford and the Globe were far apart, and he gives Anne credit for having raised the kids, Susanna and the twins, Hamlet and Julia, almost single-handedly. And she challenges the double standards that apply in terms of things like infidelity, where Will was known to get about a bit. And on that subject, it segues, if you remember back to the poem I cited earlier that talked about the line that included the phrase, "nothing like the sun." That brings me to my last book, which is Anthony Burgess's novel called Nothing Like the Sun. And if you look closely, you can see there is our friend Shakespeare with a female companion. And this book is about a fictionalized version of Shakespeare's love life. And if I look at the back, the lives and loves of William Shakespeare, poet and playwright, have been open to as much fictional and non-fictional speculation as his work. Did he really love his wife, Anne Hathaway? Was the Earl of Southampton just a good friend? Who was the Dark Lady? Why did he cease to be sweet Master Shakespeare and become instead the purveyor of a dark and nasty vision of the world? What was all that business about a second best bed? When Burgess takes on the bard, the result is a vivid, lusty, and dazzling novel, as rich and authentic as it is extraordinary. Now, this book is all of 231 pages, so I'm going to sneak this under the radar for Shorty September and tick a box for Shaketember as well, because I have been wanting to read this book for a long time, and I think this is the perfect opportunity. So many books, so little time, as I always say, but that's my my introduction to Shaketember. I've selected a couple along the way which I've undertaken to read, and most of them, I'll admit, are the shorter ones, which I think I could get into my Shorty September time frame. But I hope you've enjoyed a little bit getting exposure to what's in my library, and I hope you're also enjoying Shaketember in your own way, whatever that is. So thank you very much again for joining me on the journey. If you've enjoyed the ride, please do all the like and subscribe stuff that we're always supposed to tell you about. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much, BookTube. Bye-bye.